Okay, so you've heard of nuclear aircraft in the sense of aircraft that carry nuclear weapons, like the B-29 from World War II, or the B-52s from Dr. Strangelove. But what if I told you there were not only nuclear-armed aircraft, meaning aircraft carrying nuclear bombs, but also nuclear-powered aircraft, meaning their engines did not run on jet fuel, but they had a live nuclear reactor on board? Well, at least they were being developed. However you choose to look at it, one thing you cannot deny about nuclear energy is its raw, incomprehensible power. And great power always carries great potential with it, but at the same time, great risk. The outlook we have on nuclear power now at the 21st century is heavily colored by the failures and threats of the last couple decades. The Cuban Missile Crisis, Chernobyl and Fukushima, and constant threat of global nuclear war. But back in the 50s, at the dawn of the atomic age, the outlook was radically different. Nuclear power seemed to be an almost magical, almost limitless source of energy, and there were plans to build nuclear ships, trains, cars, and aircraft.
New devices must be developed.
This video tells the story of how nuclear planes were developed, but also why they were eventually cancelled. As soon as nuclear power was first harnessed in the 1940s, not for building a bomb, but for energy production, people began to dream up use cases for it. The Navy began looking into nuclear-powered ships. There were ideas for nuclear-powered space rockets by a cheeky young chap working at the Manhattan Project. And the Air Force began investigating in nuclear planes. The main attraction was that nuclear reactors, despite their prohibitive size and weight, had a huge advantage of giving planes basically limitless range. This had become of particular interest because the USA were facing off with the USSR at the time in the Cold War. So strike distances had become intercontinental. A nuclear propulsion for aircraft program was kicked off in the USA in 1946. And nuclear reactors were being engineered that would fit on board a large bomber. The largest one available at the time was the Convair B-36 Peacemaker, an absolute giant powered by 6 propeller engines and 4 jet engines. The nuclear reactor was intended to go onto its successor, the B-60, which was just a jet version of the B-36. Or even a completely new design called WS-125. There were 3 major engineering problems to solve. First, you needed a nuclear reactor small enough to fit on an airplane. Second, it had to somehow power the engines. And third, you needed to shield the crew and instruments from the radiation. While the nuclear propulsion system was still in the design stage, a live reactor was built into the bomb bay of a single prototype craft to test the radiation shielding. This craft was designated NB-36, where the N obviously stood for nuclear. It completed 47 test flights in the mid-50s, most of those with the reactor running. And again, the reactor was not yet powering the engines. It was just there to see whether the radiation issue could be solved. And fortunately for everyone involved, the shielding did work. The nuclear engine, however, proved to be more difficult to realize. The principle of a jet engine is that the compressor at the front compresses the air from the intake to high pressure, which then has fuel injected into it and the mixture is ignited in a combustion chamber. This highly pressurized and hot gas is ejected at high speed through the exhaust and pushes the plane forward. The turbine is just there to take out a small part of the energy to operate the compressor at the front. For nuclear engines, there were several different design ideas, but they all revolved around using the nuclear reactor to heat up the air instead of burning jet fuel. It was an iron rule of the Cold War that whatever one side did was soon mirrored by the other side also trying that. So obviously the Soviets also had a nuclear plane program going. They also used a large bomber modified to carry a reactor for radiation experiments, but without nuclear propulsion installed. This was their plane, the Tupolev Tu-95 LAL, which stands for Letaющая атомная лаборатория, which translates literally to flying atomic laboratory. There was also a design for a nuclear bomber by reactor, the M60, but this never got produced before it was cancelled. But, true to form for the Cold War, there was a nuclear bomber scare in 1958, when the reactor M50, a conventional jet aircraft, was misidentified as a fully operational nuclear-powered aircraft. Despite the successful radiation tests, as well as some progress on the reactors and nuclear engines, all programs for nuclear aircraft were cancelled at around 1960, both in the US and the USSR. The concept had been in development for about a decade and had cost billions without producing a functional prototype or even getting close to one. While the Navy's programs had delivered the first nuclear submarine by 1945, as well as the first nuclear aircraft carrier by 1960, the nuclear aircraft simply had too many drawbacks. The reactor took too much space and introduced too much weight to a machine that, well, had to fly through the air. Even though a lot of progress was made with molten salt reactors, it was still very heavy and the shielding for the crew made the problem worse. Because you can only block nuclear radiation by very dense materials, so the shielding has to be, by definition, heavy. People were also aware of the risk of flying a nuclear reactor through the air, including overpopulated areas. While people had not experienced Chernobyl at the time, they had experienced this. And while a nuclear plane crash wouldn't set off quite that, in terms of radiation, it could have a similar result. Also, even if it had turned out perfectly, much of the potential gains could never be realized. Because even if the plane would be able to fly around for weeks, the crew would not. And again, true to form for the Cold War, technological progress was very fast-paced. There had been several innovations between 1955 and 1960 that had made the concept of a nuclear-powered plane simply obsolete. Submarines could now launch nuclear missiles, so they could perform the intended role of the nuclear bomber much better. They could actually remain at sea for months and launch a nuclear attack at any time, while being much harder to find and destroy. The threat of high-flying bombers had been severely curtailed by the arrival of jet fighters and anti-aircraft missiles. High-flying, slow bombers were suddenly no longer untouchable, but rather extremely vulnerable. Also, the first intercontinental nuclear missiles had become operational and had outcompeted nuclear bombers almost immediately. While it would take a jet bomber around 10 hours or more to reach their targets in the USSR, or even about 20 hours for prop aircraft like the B-36, those missiles would get there in roughly half an hour. Finally, the practice of aerial refueling had reached maturity, so keeping a plane in the air for a long time was already possible. It should be noted that the nuclear aircraft programs had been cancelled primarily for strategic and financial reasons, not so much for technical ones. So what if they hadn't been cancelled but had been funded for another decade or so? Could it have been done? While the end product would certainly have been way too expensive and probably somewhat impractical, and maybe not have that great aerodynamics, it seems at least feasible. The technical problems did seem difficult, but not insurmountable. Either way, I think we can all be grateful that this never became a thing.